movement strategies, that's a symptom of multiple sclerosis and other movement type disorders. So if you can keep the myelin healthy, then it could be the case that you could keep the action potentials from the muscle, from the neuron to the synaptic cleft more effective. And if that's the case, maybe you can use regeneration of myelin sheath as a combatant to multiple sclerosis and other dyskinetic movement disorders. The larger the diameter of an axon is, the faster it can propagate an action potential. Right now we're on slide 18. There are neuromuscular transmitters that are going to be released from the presynaptic cleft to the postsynaptic cleft. And when the neuron gets to a particular site, there's like, this is the neuron will go very, very close to the postsynaptic cleft, but there's a space in between. And that space in between is going to be filled with neuromuscular transmitters. If enough neuromuscular transmitters go from the neuron through the synaptic cleft into the dendrites of the next neuron, then the action potential will propagate, or it will result in things like calcium being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum so that you can initiate muscle contractions in skeletal muscle. There's the axon, then the synapse, and then the dendrites. The dendrites are going to receive electrical signals from other axons. The synapse is where the neuromuscular junction, or the junction between one neuron and another neuron. And then you have the presynaptic and the postsynaptic cells or portions of that axon. Figure 3.4 is an artist's rendition of that. At the top, you have your synaptic, your presynaptic neuron and receptors, and at the bottom you have your postsynaptic receptors. Now, all of the acetylcholine is going to be transmitted from one side of the axon through the synaptic cleft through what's called synaptic vesicles. If enough synaptic vesicles go across the gradient and are connected to those postsynaptic receptors, in order for acetylcholine to get into the postsynaptic neuron or the postsynaptic cells, there needs to be enough acetylcholine, and those acetylcholines need to attach to the receptors for acetylcholine. All right, if enough acetylcholine attaches to enough receptors, then the signal is propagated from one neuron to another. An action potential can only move in one direction from the cell body down the axon to the dendrites. And then when it gets to the end of that axon, it's going to release neuromuscular transmitters or neurotransmitters. In this case, we've talked about acetylcholine, but there's others. There's dopamine. Acetylcholine is going to initiate a muscle contraction, and dopamine is going to help withdraw that particular dopamine neuromuscular transmitter so that a muscle can relax. That's why Parkinson's disease is a deterioration of the basal ganglia, which makes dopamine. So if there's not enough dopamine and there's too much acetyl-CoA, then what's going to not acetyl-CoA, dopamine and I don't know. If there's too much of the exciting neuromuscular transmitter, then there's not enough dopamine to help your body relax. And because there's too much, acetylcholine, because there's too much acetylcholine rushing through the system, there's going to be too much movement. Hyperkinetics, and hyperkinetics is going to come out as either rigidity of the muscle or muscle tremors. So if individuals who have Parkinson's disease have a little bit more dopamine, which is the actual the thing that they do to treat the thing that they do to treat Parkinson's disease is to give medication that has dopamine, so you can try to quiet down that acetylcholine response. The neuromuscular junction is a different kind of synapse. Sometimes axons will attach to other neurons or other dendrites of other neurons, but in the case of the neuromuscular junction, the axon is attached, well, not directly, but is indirectly attached to the neuromuscular junction, to the muscle fiber. So the postsynaptic cell in that case is going to be the muscle fiber. And the action potential is going to rush across from the dendrites through the muscle fiber, and it's going to result in a repolarization of the muscle fiber, and that's going to result in a release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and eventually is going to result in a muscle contraction. We're on figure 22 right now. Slide 22, figure 3.5. It just shows a schematic of the neuromuscular junction where I have my presynaptic neuron and my synaptic vesicles, and that's going to release acetylcholine into the motor end plates of the postsynaptic muscle fiber. And again, it functions very similar to how action potential is propagated from one neuron to the next, but the end result in this particular propagation of the action potential is going to be a combination or an intertwining of the actin-myosin so that a contraction can occur. In regards to the number of neuromuscular transmitters, there are many neuromuscular transmitters. There are small and large neuromuscular transmitters, but we're going to focus predominantly on acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine stimulates muscle contraction, and norepinephrine stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. We'll talk about the sympathetic nervous system in the next couple of slides. What the sympathetic nervous system is going to do is it's going to make your heart rate and your blood vessels dilate so you can get more blood to your muscles so that you can get the hell out of wherever you are. All right, it's the fight or flight nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to do other things like regulate digestion and sleep and reduce heart rate so that you can save energy. So that you can conserve all of the food that you've eaten and make it so that you'll have energy for another bout of activity later on. Okay, slide 24. I'll get back to. I just have to make sure that I touch up on some of that stuff. The central nervous system is known as your brain. There's many different parts of your brain, obviously, that do different things, but again, when we get into this section, it's going to say things like the cerebellum does this and the brain does that, and this section of the brain is responsible for that. And that's again a very top-down method. If this section of the brain is responsible for that, how does it know how to do that? What language does it spit out information? Does the brain save information from before and utilize preconceived information so that it can make better plans in the past? And if so, where does it save the information? The whole chapter is very top down, so I think that you just have to read it with a bit of a grain of salt. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. They're called they're connected by a tissue in the middle called a corpus callosum. We're going to go into a little bit of brain anatomy right now, and I don't necessarily think that this class is about the anatomy of the brain, although I guess it's important in some manner to understand how each section of the brain is going to control movement. But I mean, I think it goes beyond the scope of an exercise physiology course, aside from the fact that, like, when you do exercise, there's going to be an increase in blood flow to the brain, there's going to be increased neural activity and things, but I don't want to necessarily get into the anatomy of the brain. I think you guys have already had that. So there are 5 lobes of the cerebellum. There's the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then you have the cerebellum in the back, the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the big gray pieces of brain that's the left and the right side of your brain. Just to go into that really quickly, the left side of the brain is mostly associated with speech and verbal tasks and finite details of logic, and the right side of the brain is more associated with creativity, singing, getting your way out of a lost situation, thinking outside the box. So one side of the brain does other things. If you have Parkinson's disease, which affects your brain, it usually starts on one side versus the other. So if individuals have a hard time speaking, or even if an individual has a stroke on the left side of the brain, usually it will, or not usually, but often, I guess usually it's going to manifest in an issue with verbal and number skills. But if an individual has a stroke or Parkinson's disease on the right side of the brain, oftentimes it'll affect creativity, the ability to locomote and find your way and get out of situations where you're lost and things like that. So we're on slide 28 right now. There's the primary motor cortex, which is in the front of your brain, and the front of your brain is going to control skeletal muscle movements. But at the same time, it says that the primary motor cortex is in control of skeletal muscle movements. How does it do that? How does it know how to do that? All right, so basal ganglia is right in the middle of your brain, and basal ganglia does what they think is two things, although they're still researching it. It creates this stuff called dopamine, which is a neuromuscular transmitter that works in opposition to acetyl-CoA. And also basal ganglia, what they think it does is it's responsible for movements that are rhythmic, like chewing. Chewing, you just do up and down, and walking is rhythmic. It's just like something that you get into this motion and you keep going for a while. So if the basal ganglia is something that can affect or positively interacts or positively establishes rhythm, if that rhythm is disrupted, or if the basal ganglia is disrupted, things like walking and chewing may be disrupted. And that's typically what the symptoms of Parkinson's disease are: hyperkinetic movements and disruption during rhythmic tasks and things like that. Your primary sensory cortex, or the part of your brain that's going to receive information as part of that closed loop theory, it's going to receive afferent information, is the parietal lobe. This is your frontal lobe, and then the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe in the back is in charge of vision, and then their temporal lobe is kind of like in the middle of your brain, and then you have the cerebellum in the back. Sometimes when you fall on the back of your head and you bang the back of your head either on like ice or on like a football field, you get like dizzy. Even if you bang the back of your head, you can see that your vision goes crazy. Or if you take like a massager and you put it on your neck, you'll see the TV has those wavy lines. It's because what you're doing is you're messing with the occipital lobe, which is the main visual lobe. You have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. They're like thermoregulators, or almost like thermostats, and that they keep the body either aware of consciousness. But the hypothalamus, what it does is it controls like almost all of the functions, whether or not you're hungry, whether or not your blood pressure is going to go up, how much you're going to breathe, the body temperature. So your hypothalamus and your thalamus are like regulators of the body's like it's a thermostat of the body pretty much. The cerebellum is going to control complex movements. I don't know how the cerebellum does that, but it says that the cerebellum controls rapid complex movements. It's just another example of the hierarchy, top-down mechanistic view. The mechanistic view of the human body was kind of developed by this guy, Rene Descartes, a long time ago, a philosopher, a scientific philosopher. And what he did is tried to find, an engineering or mechanical equivalent to each part of the body, where the lungs are like bellows, and the heart is like a pump, and the eyes are like cameras, and the brain is like the control center or the top of this marionette that you kind of establish all of the electrical potential. That's a mechanistic view of the human body. It's an old philosophical view, and it's rooted in dualism, and but that's a very structured way at looking at the systems of the body, and it's probably up to a lot of debate whether or not the body functions as a mechanical system. The brain stem relays information, obviously, between the upper part of the central nervous system and the periphery of the nervous system. It's made of the midbrains, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. I'm not going to necessarily think that we have to go into the minutiae details of what all the sections of the brain are doing. Figure 3.6, slide 32 gives you an artist's rendition of it. If you see there's a section in the middle of the brain that's kind of like almost like outlined in white or whatever, or a little bit cloudy, that's where the basal ganglia and the midbrain would be, and the pons and the diencephalon. So so those are going to be where all of the little regulators of the brain are gonna be housed. The frontal lobe is for movement. The parietal lobe is more for sensory information. The occipital lobe is for visual information, and anyway, so that's brain physiology. In regards to the spinal cord is continuous with the bottom of the brain stem. It turns right into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going to be a combination of afferent and efferent information. The efferent nerves are descending. They're going from the brain stem into the body, and they're giving motor action potential information to the periphery. The ascending or afferent fibers are going to give feedback from the muscles up to the brain. The way I remember it is that the afferent nerves, afferent starts with an A, and afferent looks like an arrow upwards, and A is an arrow upwards. So afferent information is giving information from the periphery upwards to the brain, and the efferent, it looks like there's like an E, and E has like tendrils. If I go like this and turn the E this way, it looks like the efferent nerves are giving information from the top down. Again, that's a closed loop motor control theory. And if you think about it right now, they're actually introducing two different motor theories within the same context. They're talking about the brain, the cerebellum is in charge of conscious movement and this and that. So the brain is sending information down, but they're also talking about this closed loop motor control theory. And hierarchy and hierarchical motor programming theory and closed loop motor programming theory are both different theories of motor control. So within the same chapter, they're kind of crossing over between two theories, almost tantalizing you to pick one or the other, or maybe they're just kind of combining the two. Anyway, it's still up to you to choose. The peripheral nervous system, slide 34. The peripheral nervous system connects the brain to the spinal cord. There are 12 cranial nerves and 31 spinal nerves, and both of them are pretty much just giving information to the skeletal muscles in regards to action potential and excitation of the muscle for contraction. There are two major divisions. There's the sensory, the afferent division, information up, and then there's the motor division, information down, continuing the closed loop. Slide 35, the sensory division is going to transmit information from the periphery to the brain. It's either with mechanical receptors, so if you push down on your skin, the skin changes its length. That's a mechanical change. So there are mechanical receptors in your skin that's going to respond to change in length or tension, and those are going to send information up to the brain. There's thermal receptors that are going to respond to temperature. There's nociceptors that are going to respond to pain. There's photoreceptors that respond to light. When you close your eyes, you can still see some light. And there's chemoreceptors that are going to respond to chemical stimuli. All of those are going to send like biofeedback information from the rest of the body back into the brain so that the brain can indirectly process that information and send a resultant or corrective efferent signal back to the muscles to make sure that the next muscle contraction or the next response by the skeletal system is effective. You have joint receptors. This is slide 36. You have receptors in your joints, you have receptors in your muscles, you have receptors in your tendons. If the muscle changes length very rapidly, the muscle thinks that it could get injured. So there are things in the muscles called muscle spindles. We'll talk about these a bit later. Muscle spindles that will send an information not to the brain, it'll send information to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will send another reflex arc back to the muscle. If the muscle thinks it's going to change length very quickly, the muscle spindle is going to give information, and then the muscle, what it's going to do is it's going to clench really tight so that it can resist tearing. That's the whole reason why you don't want to do things